We're going to have a conversation about clinical trials. Ooh. We're going to do this session as a panel discussion, which we haven't had yet this morning in our summit. I'll introduce each of our speakers shortly, but just very quickly, we've got Lani and Jess and Sebastian and Monique. And I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical trials, and then each of our panellists is going to speak for a short time. And then the most important part is we're going to have a fair bit of time in this session to actually hear your questions and see how our panellists answer those. Oh, we've got a bit of an echo in the back. Is everything okay? Yep, okay. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about clinical trials. I know different people have different levels of experience with this topic. And as you can see here, it's pretty complicated. I like this picture because thinking about this process of developing medicines as a funnel that goes from lots of things going into it and sometimes only one thing coming out of it is a really useful way to remember that clinical trials are part of that process, but not always result in finding out about an effective therapy. So to zoom in, we often have many thousands of compounds that are worked on in laboratories. But then we move through to what's in this picture described as stage 3, clinical trials. And if we think about totally averages, it might take about 5, sometimes more, sometimes less clinical trials before we end up with one successful medicine for Mito. So we know there'll be lots of trials. And the good news is that there are a lot of trials underway for mitochondrial disease. And so it's important at this point as a community with lots of different types of mito that we get familiar with clinical trials so we can support them, hopefully towards more treatments and eventually cures for mitochondrial disease. But they do take a long time and lots of effort and lots of money. You might hear a little bit in this discussion about the different phases of clinical trials. So I just wanted to introduce those so you have an idea of what this is. Phase 1 is mostly about safety. So is this new medicine actually going to make people better, or is it going to put them at too much risk? And remember, these human trials come often after we've trialled new medicines in animals already. Phase 2 moves into patients that actually have the condition. So they might actually have Mito. And it continues to look at safety, and it also starts to collect evidence about whether the therapies work, whether the treatments are actually making a difference. Phase 3 is probably what we mostly hear about in Australia for Mito trials. Phase 3 trials are some of the biggest ones, and they'll often occur, particularly for rare diseases like Mito, in different countries and lots of different centres. So you can see there the number of people involved increases in each phase. Phase 3 is really important about collecting information about whether it works or not. And most of the time in a phase 3 study, some people will be on the treatment and some people won't be. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in this session as well. And the last phase to remember is about phase 4. Phase 4 is often occurring either while we move from phase 3 to making the medicine available in the real world while we're waiting for it to be approved, and oftentimes beyond that as well. So we continue to learn more about whether the medicine works and what risks might be involved. So that's a little introduction, and each of our speakers will probably add much more of their expertise to that. The last thing I wanted to highlight in this very quick introduction is that because of the huge number of therapies being worked on for mitochondrial disease, Mito Foundation has started to look at this topic in more detail. And earlier this year, we launched a clinical trials action plan developed in collaboration with Research Australia, trying to answer the question of what could the Australian Mito community, people affected by Mito, Mito Foundation, Mito clinicians, do to increase clinical trials in Australia. This was important to us because we discovered that while there were lots of different clinical trials happening for mitochondrial disease, lots of different types of Mito, lots of different therapies, Australians had had access to very few of those. Many of those trials were happening only in the United States, some happening with access to people living in the United States and Europe, but very few were coming to Australia. And we think it's important that Australians have a choice to join clinical trials. So the specific stats there for those that like numbers was that we found, is that 37? I should know these numbers by now. 37 phase 2, 3 or 4 clinical trials, but only 3 of those had access in Australia. And when we ranked Australia against the rest of the world, we were hovering at about 10th. We want to be higher than that. We want to have more and more trials here for people to choose to be able to access. So that's what the Clinical Trials Action Plan goes into. Thank you for those of you who were at our Community Summit in Melbourne last year. I think there's a few people who've seen their faces on that slide. We had a discussion in that summit about how people that were at the summit felt they wanted to learn about clinical trials and how they wanted to be supported during clinical trials. And that directly informed the actions that we put in the Clinical Trials Action Plan. So thank you. And this is a taste of what's in that plan. So this is the work that Mito Foundation's doing. So we're trying to find ways that we can help to build clinical research capacity. And Sebastian, as a doctor, will help us to talk about one of the most important ingredients in a clinical trial, which is the doctor that's involved in actually running the trial. Number 2 is a little bit about why we're here today. So how do we make sure the Mito community is ready to learn about trials, to make decisions about participating, and also to be well supported during that process? And the last area is generally about strengthening collaboration. And that includes collaboration between Australian doctors, Australian patients, Australian medicine companies, and overseas, and strengthening that all around. So I'm going to go back. I should have reordered these slides. Sorry, Laura, this is my bad. Let's leave this one up for a little bit. That's the end of my talk, and I am going to be the moderator of this panel from now on, so I'm going to stop offering my own thoughts. Our first panellist that we're going to hear from, I've done this around the wrong way, sorry Monique, is Jess. Jess Stevenson is a clinical trial operations manager at PYC Therapeutics. She has over 10 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry and 7 years of working directly on clinical trials. PYC, as Jess will explain, is an Australian biotech company. So this is kind of unique in the mito space because most of the companies working on mitochondrial therapies are based internationally and particularly in the US. And particularly PYC is working on a therapy for autosomal dominant optic atrophy. And Jess came along today because she's really passionate about building strong partnerships between patients, researchers and industry to ensure that every study keeps the patient experience at its heart. Jess, would you like to speak from there or would you like to come up here? I don't mind. Come up here then. Yeah. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Claire, for the wonderful introduction. As you mentioned, I'm very, very passionate about clinical trials, and I'm very, very excited and feel very privileged to speak on behalf of our company about clinical trials. Being an Australian-based company, I'm very patriotic as well, and so very, very passionate. The first thing I wanted to speak about is the starting point for clinical trials. So before you even begin planning a clinical trial, there are quite a number of things that need to happen. And the very first step is actually a discovery stage. And this is where scientists will try and understand the condition and the disease. And this really requires an in-depth level of understanding where they look at everything that flows into the condition. So the function down to the cell, even all the way down to a molecular and gene level where you're trying to identify a certain variant. And that is really important because what your next phase will be is then to look at whether you can correct for this. And so you'd be looking at the treatment and testing that. And so you do your preclinical work, and so you're testing this medicine both in the lab, in cells first, and then in animals. And so once you have this scientific evidence, you would then want to ensure that you can produce your medicine and do so in a consistent and safe way. So you would move on to your manufacturing and quality work. And this is all a really, really exciting phase of clinical development because you're getting hints of the treatment working. And so even if it's not quite working to what you'd anticipate, you would then go back and refine your approach before it's ever exposed to any people. And finally, when you have all of this body of evidence, you would submit to a regulator, and the regulator would evaluate your entire package. They would make sure that it is scientifically sound. They would ensure that it is justified from a safety perspective so that you can gain an approval to then move into clinical trials. The second thing I want to speak about is the next phase of that. So when you have that potential treatment, where do you go to then run your clinical trial? And so in the Mito space, Claire has spoken about how a lot of studies will begin in the US, and there's many reasons for this, but to funnel it down to 3 key reasons. One of them would be clinical infrastructure, the second is Mito population, and the third is regulator support. So to speak to clinical infrastructure and what that looks like in the US is you have these highly established patient advocacy networks and registries that work in close collaboration with clinics and hospitals that have a specialized care in Mito treatments and experience in Mito trials. And they work in quite close collaboration in a what I would describe as a well-running ecosystem to be able to run clinical trials. So in contrast, in Australia, whilst we have world-class researchers and clinical experience, that ecosystem is a little bit more fragmented, where you might have a individual researcher who has a really keen interest, and so they're driving that research. But the collaborations in these registries are still something that is growing, and so we can't quite move at the same pace as you could in the US, or the scale that you would in the US. And I'd mentioned the second point, which is a Mito population, and so you cannot run clinical trials without Mito involvement, without recruitment and enrollment into your study. And so in the US, you have a larger patient population, and so you can run, again, a clinical trial in a much more efficient way. And the third thing I'd mentioned is the regulator support. And so clinical trials are incredibly expensive to run, and the financial risk is even greater in a rare disease area because you're working to find a treatment that is in, again, a smaller population. And so the US regulator, so the FDA, has established pathways to aid with this. So one of them is tax benefits. The other is a fast track development program, both of which will help from those aspects. Once you do have an idea of where you want to run your study from a country perspective, you also need to then decide where you're going to run your clinical trial specifically, so which clinics will be involved. And there are a lot of things that flow into this as well, a lot of considerations that you need to make. When you're selecting these hospitals and clinics, we actually refer to them in clinical trials as sites. And when you're looking to evaluate sites, you're probably going to hear a bit of an overlap in terms of theme of what I've just spoken to, but you're looking for doctors and physicians and nurses who have the expertise and also want to collaborate and partner with you on the study. And so they really have to have this understanding of the condition, and then an appreciation for the science, so for the medication that you're developing and the study. On top of that, some experience in clinical trials is really very much required, and the reason for that is because they are quite complex to run, and so they're complex from an operational perspective. So there are a lot of things that these clinics have to adhere to because they're very, very highly regulated, and so there are many, many, many rules that come both from the regulator but also from the people running the clinical trial. And so having some type of experience will always support that, and so it's not that everyone has to be highly an expert in clinical trials, but you need to have at least a couple of people with some experience in the operations of running a study. And so the second thing you would look for is, I've spoken about infrastructure, and so these sites need to have the right supports to be able to run the study from a resourcing perspective. And so looking at things like, do they have the right equipment to be able to perform the assessments? Do they have the right services? So will they have the bed space if an overnight stay is required? Do they have a pathology that they can access, or an imaging service that they can access, or any specialty testing? And so those things need to be in place if that's a requirement of the study. The other thing you would look for, and I've mentioned this, is a population. And so you need patients to enroll into your study. Do these physicians have those connections with people with Mito that would be eligible for the study and be willing to participate in the clinical trial? And then you also need to have an approvals process. And so, as I mentioned, clinical trials are very highly regulated. And so in Australia, we have the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is our regulator, but then locally, each clinic and hospital will have an ethics committee, and they'll also have an institutional governance process. And so having those bodies and them having a clear and fair and timely review and approvals process is also really important. I think the last thing I'm going to speak about, and everyone would have already picked up on this, but I've spoken about a number of people that are involved in clinical trials. It is extensive. There are a lot of parties, but to sort of run through them at a high level, I've spoken about the regulator. So in Australia, we have the TGA, and they oversee the study. They have to be notified when a clinical trial is run in Australia. They have the authority to audit and inspect clinical trials, and they oversee the manufacturing supply of all of the supplies that are required for that clinical trial. I've spoken about the ethics committee, and really they're in place to ensure that patients are safe. They oversee their well-being and rights. There are certain reporting requirements that they mandate, so things on annual safety reporting as well as progress reporting as well. What's really obvious in terms of involvement is the sponsor company, so the company that has developed the medicine and is funding the clinical trial and the development of that. And they sometimes work with a contract research organisation, and so they are responsible for the day-to-day activities, so the operational side of the clinical trial. I've mentioned the doctors and physicians and nurses and the whole team of allied health professionals that really come together to make this work, and are really at the forefront of facilitating clinical trials. And last but certainly not least are people with Mito, because without them, there would be no clinical research or clinical development in this area. And so having their families and their involvement really helps progress clinical trials. that's me.
I gave Jess a series of questions, and I'm impressed not only that she remembered all of those questions, but she spoke with zero notes about all of them. So if you take something away from Jess, other than being incredibly intelligent, but incredible smart people involved in clinical trials as well. Thank you so much. The next person I'm going to put on the spot is Dr. Sebastian Lush. Would you like me to ask you the question, Sebastian, or would you just like to do a Jess and just tell us all the things that you know? Well, would you like me to do it as a Q&A? The mic, and I'll ask you. There's people online waiting for your mic. So first I'll start by introducing Dr. Lush. So Sebastian works as a neurogenetics fellow at the Neuroscience Research of Australia, or the Neuro Clinic, doing his training particularly with a name many of you know, Carolyn Sue. So he studied his medical degree at the University of Sydney, lots of scholarships and awards, I'll skip through those, training at St Vincent's Hospital and Royal North Shore, and has been delivering clinical trials, clinical care for neurogenetic conditions, particularly mitochondrial disease, and also he's doing some research on cell lines. So not only is he a medical doctor that works with patients, he's also a scientist working in the lab, particularly on 3243 patient-derived cell lines. So a great researcher, and when Jess talks about the clinical researchers that are needed to be able to run trials locally, we're hopeful that Sebastian continues to be one of those in Australia. So, are you ready?
Yeah.
Because you didn't memorise the questions that I sent you last week. So the first question for you, Sebastian, is how do you or other clinician researchers make a decision about which clinical trials to get involved with?
So I think it's a bit of a complex puzzle. I think sometimes we're approached either through our clinical trial coordinator, Judith, who's sitting over there, or there are often within particularly in rare diseases, people who are considered to be key opinion leaders. And so Professor Sue in this country is definitely, a key opinion leader, and Christina Liang, who also has quite a lot of clinical trial experience, both at Neuro and at Royal North Shore. And so sometimes companies who are considering running these trials will approach these people who are known to have a profile in the space, and they'll approach them when they're thinking about designing a trial and about what the realities of designing that trial for the particular country are. And so then we have to kind of make an assessment of, are we able to deliver what the company is asking from us? So all the things like what resources we have available, what other trials we might be running at the same time. Is there extra resource that we need to ask the company for? We need to evaluate the science behind what the particular product or molecule designed is for. And I think what's really important for us as clinicians is also to try and understand the safety, because at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to be enrolling the patients in the trials. So we need to have a clear understanding of what risks have been identified, but probably also what's more important is risks that haven't been identified, and a way to kind of explain that to our patients with confidence, and have confidence that the company is, has looked at all of that in detail. And then we're kind of fortunate at an institute like Neuro, where we're kind of in partnership with Prince of Wales Hospital, in that we have access to a lot of the hospital resources as well as the research institute resources. And therefore, we know we have clinical governance and we have ethics boards. And so a lot of the kind of logistical registry frameworks, that require everything to be looked at to make sure that it is kind of safe and all the protocols are up to date, are taken care of by our ethics boards and our governance boards, and so they kind of look at the legal components and the rest of it. But I think for us, the main question we ask ourselves when we're approached is, is this right for the patient set that we have? So the other really important thing is, do we have a group of patients in mind or people in mind for the trial that fit the eligibility requirements for the trial, and that we think will have good outcomes as a result of participating in the trial?
Lots to think about. Jess talked a lot about trials run by medicines companies, and the majority of trials for Mito have been run that way, but not all trials are. So can you explain a little bit about investigator-led trials and how they're different to clinical trials that are run by medicines companies?
So investigator-led trial is essentially where a clinician or a clinician scientist has kind of got a question about a disease or an intervention, and they've kind of built enough rationale to decide they want to answer that question themselves. And sometimes this might be because it's not a interventional trial. So there are trials called observational trials. So an example is at the moment we're doing a natural history study of mitochondrial disease. And so that often involves observing people and collecting information over several years, as we're also collecting biospecimens for that, and trying to answer questions about, well, what does the disease actually look like in our population in Australia? What does it look like? What are the factors that influence changes in that, in progression? And then trying to answer some questions about that as a result. Occasionally, investigators will lead trials where it might be a drug that is old. So it's past its patent, it's now a generic drug. And so there may be less commercial interest in trying to find whether or not this drug works in another disease. And so there's got some evidence, some preclinical evidence, and they've done a kind of drug repurposing. And so you may see investigator-led trials more frequently in those drug repurposing type events, sometimes in partnership with industry. And also sometimes earlier in the process. So you may see in the phase 1 trials, you may see more investigator-led trials, and then they partnership with industry in order to do the larger scale trials, just because cost becomes a barrier then. I think the main difference is often there's a little bit more of an academic question with the investigator-led trials, because they're often being led by academic researchers as opposed to kind of industry. And so the questions being asked may be subtly different, and it may be less likely to result in a kind of commercial drug. But, there are successful drugs out there that have started in the academic space and then have been, shown to be efficacious or potentially have signals in small populations, and then have been, either kind of partnered with industry to expand into a broader space.
Your colleague, Dr. Christina Liang, showed us outcomes from studies that have been done on dietary supplements in Mito in the opening session. Is it fair to consider a lot of those? I don't know, you weren't here, but a lot of those I think were probably investigator-led studies because of the nature of the medicine/supplement didn't have a pharmaceutical company behind it.
So I guess that might be the kind of question people have asked themselves, is this particular substance helpful? We think there's a rationale behind it. Coenzyme Q10 is kind of the obvious one. We think there's a rationale as to high levels of this, and often people have shown it in a dish. So they've exposed cells to a higher level of a particular nutrient substance, and then they've shown that the mitochondrial function has improved. But it might be harder to get industry behind that because of the, it's harder to kind of get that patented.
In the interest of time, I'm going to skip a question. We might come back to it later. But my last question for you, Sebastian, is what is your advice to your patients when they're considering participating in a clinical trial?
So I think first and foremost, you should approach your regular doctor who looks after you globally for your mitochondrial illness and ask them whether they think it's appropriate, because they know you. And the main thing we want to know is that you're kind of ready to go into a clinical trial. Generally, people need to be relatively stable in their disease state. So they often need to have not many medication changes. They need to be not having too many attacks. If someone's having stroke-like episodes, they'll often need to have a period of, a month or so where they haven't had any neurological symptoms that are new. And I guess the other really important thing is to understand that clinical trials are different to regular clinical care. There's often a much more stringent requirement on you to attend follow-up visits. There's much less flexibility, and there's actually quite a lot of burden sometimes placed upon the participants. And, it's really important that we kind of support, and there's lots of support out there, often from the companies, to help people make it to all of these appointments, to minimize that burden that's there. But really, I think before you enroll, you need to understand, well, what is this trial going to ask of me? Do I need to get down to Sydney, every week for 2 months, or, is it every month? Am I able to do some things at home, but am I going to have the energy to do those things at home? And then also the other thing for us to understand is, are you eligible? So eligibility criteria is really complex. And so we might think someone's eligible, but as we work through the screening process, we find they're not. So to be aware that even if you're expressing interest, there may be some limits as to whether or not you can participate. And then I think the other thing is risks. So just to understand, we need to be able to explain to you what the risks and benefits are. I think this is linking to the last question you were going to ask, which is kind of what do people struggle to understand? sometimes you may not find out what the result of the trial is. So you might participate in a trial, the trial might end, and if the company decides not to proceed or that result isn't published, we may never get a formal notification of what all the results of the trial were. So there can sometimes be these uncertain periods. The flip side of that is if the trials do look positive, there's often kind of open label extensions which allow you to continue on the drug. There's often compassionate access schemes, and I think we're going to be talking about that later, that allows people to access that drug if it has early signs that it's working, but it hasn't been fully approved yet. So sometimes clinical trials can be a way to get access to these drugs and continue taking them before the regulatory process is entirely finished. And we've seen that in many other kind of subspecialties of medicine. But I think it's hard sometimes for patients who are, or for our community who are active parts of these trials to wrap their head around that they may not be notified, even though they're individually part of it. Research, you don't always you don't own the results, so to speak. So that can be frustrating for us as clinicians as well.
Yeah, because I think sometimes even clinicians don't get given the results as well. It's not that that patients specifically are being excluded. Thank you so much, and I appreciate you building in the answer to the question that I skipped. I like your style. Our third panellist. Oh yeah, okay. I like it. Our third panellist is Monique Alves, who's head of medical for a different medicine company, Biogen, for Australia and New Zealand. So she leads the medical affairs operations, so making this happen on the ground here. Biogen doesn't have a Mito-specific medicine in its pipeline or its product set, but Monique has worked on multiple sclerosis and other rare neurological conditions, has a clinical background in nursing and stroke medicine, so understands Mito and neurological conditions from that point of view. And I think you've prepped some slides, Monique, so would you like to come and deliver those from up here? I'm just going to have to fast forward through my slides, so just ignore that. There we go, just the green one to go forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Claire. It's my privilege to be here with you. When we cross the line after the hospital and we go to a pharmaceutical company, I'm still the same nurse. I'm still nice. Sometimes not. But it is a real privilege to talk to the community because there are some guardrails that the regulations put on us, and we cannot talk directly with patients about therapies. So that's why I'm going to talk about very specific, very unspecific pathways on how to make sure that the drugs are accessed by the community. So I am the medical director. I'm responsible for a team. I was explaining what I do in lay terms. I make sure that my team, which is a medical team, talk to the doctors, explain how our drugs work. And then we also have the commercial people because we have to sell the drugs to make money enough to invest again and produce new drugs, right? So we need to make sure that this conversation also are based on science. And you heard that word TGA. I need to obey to the TGA. There are a lot of regulations as well for us to talk about this, to do our research. So it's a lot of things, but you have to remember that I'm still a nurse, okay? So Biogen is a company that was founded by people who won Nobel Prizes. So it's a technology company. Our foundation was on multiple sclerosis, but we are a lot on rare disease. So in the future, I hope that Jessica company is going to be exactly in our position that we had therapies saving and impacting millions of people's lives. So I have two objectives today. What do clinical trials measure and why these measures are chosen? We heard a little bit about that and what happens when it finishes, right? So what is the real life thing? Who here uses artificial intelligence to do things? I have a secret to tell you. My artificial intelligence program is called Copilot, but I call him Bob. So I asked Bob to work for me and he worked for you guys, okay? So it's a presentation from me and Bob. So when our researchers are testing, what they have to think? So we have to think that improve the symptoms, live longer, what are the side effects? So they are going to pick and choose things that are going to be important for that condition. But it needs to be something aligned between people like behind the scenes, like Jessica company, behind the scenes of the doctors, behind the scene of the regulators as well. It's not me coming and say, oh, I want to do a research and I want to see how people with blue eyes behave in this therapy. No, it needs to be very, very clear. When they going to do this, each condition is going to require one thing, and also looking at the time that is important for that. So it cannot be, I'm just going to observe this patient for 1 week. It needs to be 1 year, sometimes 2 years. That's why it takes so long for us to have some results. And then there is efficacy and safety. One of the things that we have in medicine, the first principles for us is like, first, do not harm. We cannot never have a drug that is going to cause more harm than actually good. So we have to make sure that the efficacy side is there, but the safety as well. For example, if the objective of the clinical trial is to make you walk longer, it cannot make you fall more, right? It's a very basic thing. After the efficacy and safety is good, both of them finish their work, clinical trial is positive, what do we do, right? So we get a lot of paper. I'm so happy that doesn't have that anymore. I'm not going to tell you my age, but before that was a lot of paper. Now it's a lot of files. And we get these files and we have to think how they are going to be used, right? Because some of the studies are not done worldwide. Some studies are not going to be done in Australia only. Some of the studies, there are some countries that they need population-wise data. For example, if you go to China, Japan, they need to have populational data. In Australia, we can use data from other countries sometimes. So if you have the data of everyone, you say, okay, what I'm going to do with that, clinical trial is here, drug is safe, drug has efficacy, what I'm going to do with that. We are not going to talk about the world, we are going to talk about Australia, right? So we are here in Australia, we have the data package, pretend that is like a bunch of paper that we have. Who do we send this? Who do you think that we have to send this bunch of paper to get this approved? Who do you think? TGA, exactly. So we have 3 steps. The first one is the TGA, which says, okay, this drug works. You can give to everyone. Where it's being made is okay. It's not in my backyard kitchen, right? So we have to make sure that's okay. All the transportation is going to be fine. The package is great. Australia is a pretty hot country, isn't it? Did you know the temperature of the country influences on that? It does. I didn't know that before when I was a nurse either. And then you have the reimbursement system, which is like, who is going to pay for that? And then you have to say the access for who is going to be that. So that's the part where when you have the final clinical trial, you're going to do to make sure that this drug is available. Remember that those people that were included in the clinical trial, sometimes they are in the placebo arm, sometimes they are on the treatment arm. Before this happens, the company can say, because everybody, the drug works, everybody that was on the placebo is going to have access to the treatment even before all of this happens, because that's the compromise also that the company will have with people. So if you think about clinical trials that way we're saying, it's an early access way for you to have access to treatments, right? So this is something that you have to think also when you're participating in a clinical trial. Marketing authorization. We go there with the bunch of papers and send the files to TGA. TGA is going to say, okay, thank you so much. You have to pay a fee for that. And they are going to analyze your data. And they're going to say, is it safe? Is it effective? How is it made? Where is it made? Who is going to touch that? How is going to be? So you have to have a sponsor here. So you have to have a company that has an address in Australia and has someone responsible in Australia to make sure that this is going to happen. How long it takes? Usually 12 months. So they receive and they are going to analyze. They send you the final report and say, okay, we recommend or we don't recommend. In parallel with that, you can talk to PBAC or MSAC. PBAC is the people that takes care of the drugs, and MSAC are the ones that take care of the procedures. For example, if you need a genetic testing, if you need something that is going to be linked to that therapy, needs to go to this 2 committee. But that's focused on PBAC. PBAC is going to say, okay, you are asking me that treatment that costs $1, but you have this one here that costs 10 cents. Why you need another one? What is the difference between these two? Why this is better and how much is better? How many people is going to take the medicine? If it's going to be, we are 27 million inhabitants, I think. If it's 27 million inhabitants, how much money is going to cost on my pocket? How much is going to cost for the government? Because usually it's left pocket, right pocket, right? So if we spend in submarines, and if we spend in, I know everything, you know that I'm not Australian, I pick at everything but the government, yeah. So is it worth it? Is $1 here that I'm going to pay for your drug? It's going to make you work more. You're going to contribute more as a taxpayer. How long you're going to live more? So those are the questions that usually happen. And this is a very financial decision of the government, right? So what is the objective of the government? Make sure that they are paying as little as less money to impact the overall budget, because the overall budget is not going to increase, right? This happens 3 times a year. So they meet 3 times a year, they receive a list of drugs, they evaluate, and then they see if they are going to reimburse or not. I've never heard of any therapy that was reimbursed in the first meeting. You had? Yeah, it's very unusual, but usually it's 1.5 meetings. They say no, and then you negotiate a little bit, and then it comes. And then after everybody say, yeah, that's safe, we are going to pay for that. So now there is the listing, which is like, who is going to have access to that? Where you're going to be available? It's going to be at the community pharmacy. It's going to be at the hospital. Who is going to give to you? When it's going to be listed? And it's the whole thing about deciding what is the listing. After everything is done, you can actually go to the pharmacy, pay the dispensation fee, and have access to the treatment, or go to see the doctor and have an infusion or something else. There is an ongoing program that it's with Medicines Australia, which is the association of the pharmaceutical companies that is working to make the PBS stronger, because if we compare to other countries, it takes like almost 1.5 years for us to have access to therapies compared to other countries. So it is always a lot of back and forth in terms of, not in terms of TGA, but in PBAC, right? And your voice matters, because when it comes to the time points, that's 3 times a year that a therapy is there, they welcome consumers' comments. So you are the expert on your disease, and you have the chance to contribute and see how that therapy would actually improve patients' lives. So when the time comes for you guys, you have the chance to contribute and make things different. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Luckily, the Mito community has already been through this with our approval of genomic testing for mitochondrial disease, I want to say 2, maybe 3 years ago, led by Professor Carolyn Sue, and they provided some amazing comments, and we were very happy that MSAC made a positive decision, so we now have that listed on Medicare. But we hope to be in a position to be having the same sort of conversations and sharing patient stories with PBAC in the years to come. Our next panellist is Lani. Oh, your intro, Lani. So Lani was diagnosed with a form of Mito called CPEO plus when she was 14. She lived with her parents, her puppy Freddie, and her younger brother, has 2 jobs, making sure all of us get access to our fast food. Lani is also the youngest member of Mito Foundation's MCAP, and taking over the reins to some extent from her dad, Hayden. And it's wonderful as a Mito Foundation team member to be able to get perspectives from Lani on from younger people living with Mito. So I've got a couple of questions for you, Lani. Are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Good. Can you share with us what your experience has been with clinical trials for Mito?
So we live in Victoria, and I found that clinical trials are mainly done in the city, where if you're living far away, it's a long day. A lot of testing, questionnaires, and other things like that.
Were you part of a specific clinical trial that your doctor asked you to become involved with?
Sorry, pardon?
Was there a specific clinical trial that you were part of?
Yes, so I was part of the Reno 10. I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And what did you think about when you were making the decision of whether or not to join that trial? What were you thinking about?
So I got told about the clinical trial from my neurologist, and he basically said, look, I think you're eligible for this. Would you want to do it? And my thought process was, I'm pretty healthy still. It could help others with Mito in all forms.
And that was the reason that you decided to join the trial?
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds very sensible. As someone living with Mito, what does it mean to you to have clinical trials available to you?
I think it's great. It shows that we're growing as a community, and that doctors and pharmacies are recognizing that we are a condition as well. It's not just like breast cancer or any other disease.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, it's time for question time. I've got a couple of pre-prepared ones to get us going, but we've heard so much amazing knowledge from all the different perspectives of our panelists. We don't have as much time as I wanted to have. So I'm going to ask one, and then I'm hoping that someone in the room will ask the second. My only question, there you go, I'm going to pick on Sebastian. So Monique shared a little, Sebastian, about the steps that follow a clinical trial that's found to have a safe and effective, efficacious, big words for it works, therapy. What's the role of a Mito specialist or another medical doctor in the process, the steps that follow a successful clinical trial? How involved do they get?
I think, our priority is to continue to care for that person clinically. So it's to continue with all the things that we do on a regular basis. If there are specific safety concerns that arose from that medication either identified in the trial or that they thought might possibly come out, the trials might finish at 3 months, but the patients, our community doesn't stop existing after 3 months. So we need to make sure that we're following up those patients carefully and ensuring that we make sure that there haven't been any kind of late safety concerns that emerge. Often there's a gap, as we talked about with the regulatory framework of even once the trial is finished, all the data is collected and analysed, and then, a commercial decision is made to seek registration and reimbursement. Because of those delays, and that can be 12 months for registration or longer, that can be several years sometimes for PBS listing, depending on, the kind of negotiations. Often we will be liaising with companies to see if we can maintain access to our population. That one of the benefits, as I said earlier, being part of the clinical trials is often then you're the first people they will go to if they are setting up a compassionate access scheme or what they call kind of open label extension trials. So that's where, you've got a placebo group and a active group, so the kind of active group. And then when the trial finishes, everyone can be transitioned onto the active medication, so that even if you were on a placebo initially, that you may then be transferred in an open label, so it's no longer blinded in the same way, and you'll be able to transition to taking the molecule. And that kind of sometimes gives us a little bit more information about the safety. And one of the trials that we're involved in at the moment at Neura is going to move into an open label after the placebo-controlled period. So that's the Tesento trial. So I think sometimes that's a concern for people is I'm on a placebo, I'm never going to get the drug. But it's particularly in rarer diseases, there's often a design for either a crossover period or for an open label period. And that means that everyone has the opportunity to be on the drug and get the benefit that we're hoping they will get from it, barring trials finishing early for safety concerns. But I think our main role is just to continue to look after people and help them understand what the end of the trial means, make sure that we're ensuring that there are no ongoing safety concerns. And then once a drug is approved, one of our jobs as clinicians is to make sure that if there are unusual adverse events or what they call post-marketing surveillance, that we report that back to the company. So if someone has, and sometimes it's not related to the drug, but if we're not sure or we think it might be, then we report it. And that's how sometimes these things that only emerge after 5 years that are safety concerns come out in what they call post-marketing surveillance. And that's a really important part of the regulatory process as well.
Thank you. Yeah, go for it.
Another thing that is very important between the collaboration between pharma and the clinician is that a clinical trial center usually is the best in class of everything, and the other centers are not the same. So we have to leverage that experience to make sure that other clinicians are going to understand how the drug works and how they have to organize. We call this center readiness. So that's where my team, it's going to partner with people like Sebastian, and we are going to design medical education programs to make sure that we can decentralize that care, and everybody can have access. As was mentioned, if you're in Melbourne, you're in Sydney, you're very lucky. But how you decentralize? We're in a big country. We have to make sure that this is going beyond the clinical trial center. So that's how we work a lot in collaboration after the clinical trials is going, and the preparation for the larger commercial availability, which the patient of the clinical trial is very different from the patient that's going to be everywhere. So that's very, very important.
Who's come up with the second question for our panel? Thanks, Laura. Laura's friends online.
So are clinical trial costs weighed up with the costs of treating Mito? So like comparison inverses, if that makes sense?
Well, I think because the funding is coming from different sources, it's not a direct comparison. That comparison is made much more at the regulatory level of the reimbursement decision, the PBAC, which I think, part of what the drug company will submit to the PBAC will be the costs of untreated illness. So a lot of that kind of health economic work that's been done, and I know Professor Sue's been involved in it, the Mito Foundation's been involved in it, is to establish, that is really helpful then at the regulatory level of making an argument that there is a cost benefit to the government in funding a resource. I think, in terms of demand for the companies, I'll probably leave that to you guys in terms of how you make decisions about funding clinical trials. That's kind of, we liaise with companies, and the funding sometimes comes from companies, sometimes from research grants for the investigator-led stuff, but it's a little bit more complex.
The cost of a clinical trial, it's basically an investment that the company is putting there. So as a big project, you're going to put all the costs that are necessary. And of course, it's something that's going to be sold in the future. So that's why the medicines would have a price. So that's, but we never understand how much it's going to cost a clinical trial or until we actually get to the end, because there are a lot of variable things. Yeah.
It is an investment decision based on risk and what's the chance of this particular therapy will end up being making money for the company in the future.
Yeah.
And whether that decision's being made by a business director or the board in a public company, or in some cases by a venture capitalist investing in a very small pharmaceutical company or biotech emerging in the US particularly, they're all making a similar decision about, do we think that the evidence we got from the lab and from the mice suggests this might work in humans, and is it worth us then investing in a clinical trial? The other interesting part, I think, for Mito in the PBAC reimbursement, health economics thing at the moment, is that at the moment our decision making in that space mostly looks at medical costs. And something that a lot of rare disease organisations are trying to do is to help those decision makers also compare the cost of treatments with the cost of things like disability support or extra support at school. Because if we can have a therapy that reduces the need for that, we think that should be weighed up when you're considering cost effectiveness. And at the moment, it's not directly appreciated when they evaluate that number of what this thing is worth. So there's a lot of reform being asked for in the PBS decision-making process, and Mito Foundation joins with other rare disease organisations to try and make some of those changes come in as well.